Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of Recast. In today's edition, we're going to talk about the principles of a good Christian leader, or we're going to look at Christian leadership principles. We're all called to be leaders, whether you recognize yourself as a leader or not. We lead someone at some point in our life. Leading your family is a good example. Leading your kids. Some people lead a team for their day-to-day work. Some people lead a ministry. We all lead in some capacity. If you don't realize that, if you say that I don't fall under any of this category, I'm not a leader, you at least lead yourself. Because we have to train our body, train our mind, train our thoughts. Paul put it this way, that like people train, an athlete trains his body. We have to train ourselves. So leading ourselves itself is requires good leadership principle. So today, in this edition, we're going to look at a couple of leadership principles, but this is going to be a series. We're going to continue looking at some principles of good Christian leadership. I don't claim to be a great leader. I lead a team in my office, and I don't claim to be a great leader. But what I'm learning from the Scripture, what I'm learning by reading other books, and what I'm learning in my day-to-day experience, I'm going to share in this podcast. The first principle of a good leader I want to share. We're talking about Christian leadership here, not general organizational leadership. So the first principle I want to share, if you look at throughout the scriptures, through the Bible, the great characteristics, one of the most prominent characteristics of a good Christian leader is dependence on God. Godly leaders know their limitations and rely on God for leading them. You can look at the Bible. Every chapter of every book in the Bible, if you see a great Christian leader, that leader, he or she will be depending on God, and that person knows their limitation. You can take Moses as an example. Moses became one of the greatest leader in the Bible. But when God called Moses to go to Pharaoh, Moses said, "Lord, I can't speak very well. I stammer. Are you sure you're calling the right person?" And God sent Aaron to speak on behalf of Moses. See, Moses understood his limitation. He's not a person who said, like, I know everything, I can do everything. Because as a leader, we need to recognize our own limitations, and we need to rely on people and rely on God. Most importantly, depend on God to help us fulfill that mission. And Moses went on to be a great leader because throughout his life, he waited for direction from God. He didn't go faster than God. He didn't go slower than God. He was always in step with God. And Gideon is another good example. Gideon was a very timid character. He was hiding in a cave and threshing wheat in fear of Midianites. But when God called Gideon, he said, "Mighty warrior." God saw something in Gideon that Gideon couldn't see it. And God transformed Gideon to be a great leader. And throughout that process, God taught him dependence on God to Gideon. At one point, he had more people in his army. God said, reduce. He cut down the number of people drastically to mere 300 men, if my memory is correct. And then God asked Gideon to go and fight a huge army, fight against a huge army with a very small number of people, 300 people. Why did God do that? Because God wanted to teach Gideon that he should depend on him, that he should know his limitation. Gideon's limitation is that he has very few people, and Gideon was relying on God, depending on God. If Gideon had like a huge army and all the weapons and everything, he wouldn't have learned that dependence on God. And David is another good example. Throughout the Psalms, wherever David has written that Psalms, you can see phrases like, Lord, I put my trust in you. Some trust in chariots, but I trust in you. And in Psalms 119, he has mentioned that, do not let me be ashamed. I put my trust in you. I keep my eyes on you. I seek your face. So David was called as a man after God's own heart. He was one of the greatest king in the history of Israel, and he became that greatest king because he put his trust in God. He depended God for his directions. He knew his limitations. He was waiting on God in every step. And some years back, I read a book called Good to Be Great, written by Jim Collins. It's a general organizational leadership book. In that book, Jim Collins talks about level 5 leadership. And he writes in that book that this form of leadership melds together the ferocity of professional will with the humility of personal character. See, even the organizational leadership talks about humility. You can't be a great leader without humility of personal character. You also put it this way, if you reach level 5, you are able to develop your company's greatness through a paradoxical combination of personal humility plus professional will. A paradoxical combination of personal humility plus professional will. Humility is very important, and understanding our own weaknesses and depending on God is very, very important characteristics of a great godly leader. The best example in the scripture is found in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Paul was given a thorn in the flesh, and Paul writes it this way: 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. He was talking about there was given me a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Today, let's remember, as we lead people, as we lead ourselves, one of the great characteristics of a godly Christian leader is understanding this principle, that God's power is made perfect in our weaknesses. We all have our own weaknesses. We all have our own blind spots. And God says, my grace is sufficient for you. Sometimes we take humility so far that we feel we are so incapable of doing God's work. That's another extreme. We should remember that if God has called you to be a leader, if God has called you to do something in your family or in your workplace or in your church, it comes with God's grace for you to do that work. Don't be too humble, humble to see that, and you fail to recognize God's grace, God's hand leading you. Sometimes we don't do God's work because we don't see God's grace. We see our weaknesses, and then we tell God, I can't do this. This is too big for me. A true leader recognizes God's grace in his or her weaknesses. God's grace is made perfect in our weaknesses. God's power is made perfect. God's grace is sufficient to do the work for which He has called us to do. So whatever work you are doing, whatever work God has called you to lead, to do, remember, His grace is sufficient for you, and His power is made perfect in your weaknesses. Let's depend on God. Let's wait on God to get direction. The second characteristics of a good, godly Christian leader is to understand, is to have wisdom to pick our battles wisely. It's to choose when to fight and when to ignore. Many times, if we come across people giving their opinions or giving their peace of mind, if I can put it that way. If you look at great leaders throughout history, not only from the Bible, but if you look at in general, if you come across great leaders, they don't pick battles, pick fights very easily. They have this knack, the technique to ignore certain harsh comments or people coming their way, because they know what battles are worth to fight and what battles are worth to ignore. Sometimes as Christians, we get people, sometimes people, we get into this challenging situation where people talk things that are hurtful. People challenge us, people tell hurtful words, and then we enter into an argument trying to prove that we are right. During this course of exchange, we lose our peace, they lose their peace, we lose our character, we lose our patience, we lose we get stressed and anxious, and then even after the situation is over, the things keeps playing in our mind, and then we get completely distracted from the calling God has called us to be. And if you look at great Christian leaders, great leaders, people know when to ignore, when to pick the right battle. And David, King David, is a great example. After several years, when he became a king, his own son Absalom formed a coup, and then he tried to kill his father. So David left Jerusalem. He fled the city because he doesn't want to enter into a civil war. So he left Jerusalem and fled Jerusalem, leaving the city to Absalom. And on his way, while he was fleeing, he was accompanied by his soldiers and some of his faithful armies. And a man called Shimei, while David was traveling, he was fleeing the city. He was on the other side of the road. The Bible says he accused David of wrong things. He said all this happened to David because he did something bad to Saul's family. He said a lot of hurtful words. He accused David, and he blamed David, and he called him a murderer. He called him a scoundrel. He used a lot of harsh words. This must be very hurting for David, because he is he's fighting a personal battle with his son Absalom, which was very hurtful, and he was crying, and he was taking all his family, and he's fleeing a city, and on top of that, Shimei is saying all his accusations, and it must be very hurtful for David. And one of David's commander, Abishai, I think, if I remember it correctly, Abishai said, "Give me one word, king. I will just kill him. I'll just take his life. Who is he to talk against you like that?" And David's response to Abishai was amazing. To Shimei, he said to his commander, "Don't bother him. Just ignore him. Don't kill him. Maybe because of his hurtful words to me, God is going to listen to me and see my plight and help me." He didn't even say any word or respond to Shimei. He just completely ignored Shimei. He didn't try to prove to Shimei that he is right, because David knew the secret that some battles are not worth to fight. Shimei is a very petty, small, narrow-minded person. And David has got bigger battles to fight. David is a great leader. He's got bigger things to focus. He needs to think about his city, his own family and sons. And if he gets into a petty battle with a narrow-minded person like Shimei, he's going to get completely distracted. He ignored Shimei. And after a few days in that situation, the battle, God gave complete victory to David, and God vindicated David from all that accusation that Shimei thrown. Shimei kept, even when David said ignore him, Shimei kept throwing stones. Bible says he pelted stones at David while David was walking along the road, but David ignored him and he just walked along. That's what we need to do. Sometimes people throw stones at you. You don't have to respond. Just ignore. When people throw stones at you, ask God for wisdom to understand what battles you can fight. Some battles are not worth to fight. Great leaders know how to pick their battles, where to focus. So today, if you are getting distracted, if you are losing your peace, if you are worried about accusations and people talking against you, or some harsh words spoken against you, and learn from David that you can focus on God and ignore people, ignore those voices. The Bible says you will keep him in perfect peace whose mind is stayed on you, for he trusts in you. Just keep your eyes focused on God. People will throw stones at you. You don't have to respond to each and every stone and lose your peace. And hope this is useful for you and encouraging for you. We'll continue to look at this edition of Recast, looking at the great principles of a great godly Christian leaders in the coming days. We'll see you soon in the next edition of Recast. Thank you and bye.